I'm Emma, one of the book club program specialists coming to you from Boston, Massachusetts. Let us know where you're from in the YouTube comments. If you have trouble commenting, make sure that you are subscribed to the Trauma Research Foundation YouTube channel. All right, so as you settle in, I'd like to tell you about the Trauma Research Foundation and outline a little of what you can expect from today's event. TRF is a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to bringing together a community of clinicians, researchers, and educators finding and implementing approaches to help heal those whose lives are affected by trauma. Our club is currently in its second year, and it's been a wonderful experience so far. Our growing team has been continually learning how to create the best experience for both panelists and our streaming audience. In this series, we have two moderators to facilitate this discussion, Atra Tarfa and Dr. Keisha Sirwa. There's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes, and I want to take a moment to acknowledge that time, attention, and care. I'm excited to introduce the TRF team that makes this production possible. Pat, our media manager, Connor, our media specialist, myself and my colleague, an amazing partner in this program, Liz, each of us are program specialists. Today's session is the first episode of this 4-part series. Each week brings together as 10 panelists to discuss Becoming Miss Burton by Susan Burton and Cari Lynn. As always, we invite our virtual community to participate in the discussion. Feel free to use the YouTube chat function to share your comments throughout the session. Our team at TRF are all tuning in with you, and we'll be sharing some comments after each discussion question. If you have trouble commenting, again, make sure that you are subscribed to the Trauma Research Foundation YouTube channel. Also, importantly, please note that this discussion is not a substitute for, nor does it replace professional mental health advice, diagnosis, or treatment. If you have any concerns or questions about your health, you should always consult with a physician or other healthcare professional in the mental health field. We'll bring information about each panelist as they respond to their first question. Panelists are invited to apply from anywhere in the world and from every background. We truly welcome voices representing a diversity of experiences and thoughts. So, to help ground us in this conversation, we're happy to offer a study guide as a companion to your reading. Please download the study guide from the link in the chat. And now I'm delighted to introduce our book club moderators, Atra Tarfa and Dr. Keisha Sirwa. So first up, Atra Tarfa is a certified trauma recovery coach supervisory level with the International Association of Trauma Recovery Coaches. She's a board member of PATH, a program to recover from addiction and its underlying trauma utilizing an internal family systems informed approach. A trauma survivor herself, Atra founded Compassionate Coaching for Complex Trauma to support other survivors. She serves as a 2-term elected district supervisor where she brings a self-led trauma-informed voice to local policy. She enjoys spending time eating the food of her mother's country, Thailand, and is always up for an adventure. Our second moderator, Dr. Keisha Sirwa, is CEO of Dr. Keisha Cares Consulting and Coaching, and specializes in public speaking, diversity, equity, inclusion consulting, and trauma-informed mindset coaching. With a passion for racial literacy education and leadership development, she brings a wealth of knowledge, experience, and global perspective to the table. Dr. Keisha's accomplishments have made her a prominent figure in the realm of public scholarship. Through TEDx Talk, Instagram, YouTube, international conference lectures, published academic works, and programmatic initiatives, she has emerged as a catalyst for change, championing racial literacy and inclusive leadership. Boasting over 20 years of experience, her scholarly pursuits and advocacy work have garnered a discerning global perspective on educational research and diversity. Thank you so much for being here in support of this community, Atra and Dr. Keisha. And now I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Keisha, who will lead us in a moment of silence.
Thank you. We would be remiss if we entered into this space and did not acknowledge the theft of life that occurred recently in Ocala, Florida. And I want to center this moment of silence with words from the book. I am on page 15. Ms. Burton writes, "But at what point does that undercurrent overtake you? At what point does the struggle to yet again try to find a place for yourself in an unwelcoming world become too much?" The death of Adjika Owens was unwelcomed. And the way in which she was stolen takes us back to Ralph Yarl. And so, in this moment of silence, I invite you to guide your thoughts into this time of reflection. I thank you. And in that respectful note, it is my honor to open up the conversation. Today, we will discuss chapters 1 through 9 of Becoming Mrs. Burton, From Prison to Recovery to Leading the Fight for Incarcerated Women by Susan Burton and Cari Lynn. This first section of the book covers the author's family and early life. Atra, would you be so kind as to bring in the first question? I don't want to do too much talking. I kind of felt myself getting emotional, so I'm just going to be human and ask you to stand in for me while I gather myself.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Question 1. And just as a reminder, if you need to take a minute to pause, anyone on our panel, us as moderators, anyone in our audience, we encourage you to do that. Just take time for yourself to pause and breathe and relax and into what it is that you're experiencing. And when you are ready, please join us again in community. For question 1, Susan was sexually abused throughout her childhood, often at the hands of those close to her. How did the trauma Susan suffered alter her perception of herself and her life? How did it change her relationships with her mother, siblings, friends, school, and community? And what might have prevented the type of violence Susan experienced in her youth? So we'll open up the panel to take your thoughts on question 1. Julia, did I see you come off mic? Oh, David. I say David.
Thank you very much, Atra. And thank you so much for the moment of silence too, Dr. Sturtevant. To me, as a trauma survivor myself, what resonated so powerfully in the writing was the immense shame and toxic guilt that Susan wore, for a lack of a better term. That was very powerful to me. And I think the other thing, besides the toxic guilt, was the blame that was placed on her, especially by family members. To me, there's always a sense of responsibility, a sense of blame. But I think when family members empower that process, I think it's personalized and that much more difficult to stop wearing and remove that responsibility.
Yeah. I can agree more. As I read through this, I saw the shame there and on this little child who wasn't hers to own, and now it was just placed as a burden upon her. Yeah, couldn't agree more, David. Julia, I see your hand next.
I definitely agree. I got to a point where I wanted to count how many times the word shame was showing up in that story, the feeling, but also Ms. Burton was naming it all the way through. In question 1, the third part of this question is something that really stood out to me. And in so many of these questions, I felt like I saw almost exact quotes from the book where she was answering these questions. And when thinking about what might have prevented the violence experienced in her youth, in chapter 3, I wrote this down. She says, "We kids were the collateral damage of my parents' histories of the worst and weakest parts of themselves and of the plain fact that neither was around during the day and we were left to raise ourselves. And this brought up for me both the logistical implications of having parents that both had to work constantly when they weren't working, were struggling with the emotional impacts of their own trauma, therefore less available to her, due to just that intergenerational trauma and the day-to-day needs of meeting the needs of their family. And it made me just think that like having a family that felt safe enough to talk to confide in, could have potentially like stopped that harm from continuing to happen if she had the emotional support she needed. But and that intergenerational trauma made that safety so much more difficult for her to attain. And something that really came to me was thinking about beyond prevention, but the aftermath of being harmed there could have been so different for Susan if she knew what to do next, if she knew it was okay to tell someone or to ask for support. Working with sexual assault survivors, so often I see that it's like that isolation, the secrecy, and the lack of community support that causes those long-term impacts of PTSD. And I think so much of this because we are lacking in a societally agreed upon safety strategy for sexual assaults. Like we teach kids what to do if there's a fire. We put on their seatbelts without a second thought to protect them from the harm of an accident. But we are so avoidant of discussing sexual assault, admitting how frequently it happens and how likely it is that it's going to happen at the hands of someone we know. And because of that avoidance, we don't teach our community how to respond when someone has been harmed. So survivors are stuck in that cycle of isolation and self-blame that stops them from asking for support. And it just like reminds me of how important it is that any one of us can learn how to normalize stress responses and understand the impacts of trauma and connect to our community to prevent these long-term impacts of PTSD, especially those of us in a position or role to be a safe enough adult for the young people in our lives, and thinking of their well-being as a collective shared responsibility for all of us. I just think we all need to equip ourselves to combat that trauma, especially when it comes to issues of, and we can't do that until we talk about it. And that's why this book means so much to me, just the fact that she's letting us know what happened and why she wasn't able to get that support.
Yeah, what I'm hearing you say in summary was, where is the seatbelt for sexual assault? Where is the seatbelt for that? Right? I love that as a metaphor. How do we protect from the jump? Eve, I see your hand, and then I see John's hand.
Yes, I just want to say that when I was reading these first few chapters, it was how transactional the relationships became, that everything became a function just to serve a means to an end. When she made a comment in the book about, I'm going to get something from this body for me while other folks, and I'm paraphrasing, it was a reminder that this was such a big burden for a young child to try and navigate her way through. The book was impactful in the repetition of that lesson. I think something that came to mind constantly with what might have been something to prevent, I kept finding myself coming back to the issue of just how normalized rape culture was a generation ago. For years, I've shook my head every time I hear a situation like this, and somewhere in the back of my head, I'm asking myself the question of who's raising these young men to think that this is fun or okay behavior, and why is it always that we blame the victim for the experience, or the shame is theirs to carry by themselves? The best prevention we can have, I think, is to not just focus on we can't just build more resilient victims. We have to intervene and stop the cycle of perpetrators. We have to reel the other half of the equation in. That's, I think, how we get to a more effective space. But I hope, I believe we're making progress in these areas. But I think that is something that would definitely have had a different outcome if it hadn't have been such a normalized, oh, it's okay for a group of boys to do something like this, and a mother could be upstairs ignoring someone's screams. So making the unacceptable not acceptable, I think, is the direction we have to move in.
Yeah.
I just want to come in and support your share. You mentioned, a line from page 47, if anyone's following us along in the book, and that also resonated with me. And I'm just going to read it to honor her words. I've been exploited my whole life, so now I not make this body work for me. If there was one thing I knew for sure, my body could get me things. And one of the earliest memories we have of her in that transactional experience was with Curly, when he would give her candy. And I'm not going to say the rawness of the line because it may be triggering for some people, but that aspect of having someone associate that with candy, and the only way she could allow herself to even ingest it was to share it with others, see them enjoy it. And in her young mind, the rationalization of that. And then, of course, the other aspect of it is the intergenerational trauma, the bitter disappointment of understanding the people who are supposed to protect you are more attached to their own comfort or whatever their trauma narrative is, and they'd rather stand in that than stand alongside you, which is what we saw when I think it was her cousin or her aunt came in and saw, and Susan must have been, she couldn't have been older than 6. She was very young. And the adult who was in the compromising position, yet she snatched Susan, called her a dirty girl, and then threatened her back into the space of secrecy. As you all have mentioned, we've already heard that verbalized. And so I just wanted to also stand alongside, because that's what this dialogue is going to be. We are committed to a community discussion, but I also thought it was very valuable that we highlight that aspect of it as well, how early it starts, the tools in which it is used, and the failure of those who are supposed to protect us, understanding that they're deeply wounded as well.
Yeah, I want to speak to that specific thing. And then I see Tony's hand, and I just want to say that my son, is out with his guy friends and so forth. And at one point, he was describing to me a story. He was recalling the narrative back, right, telling me the story. And then in his recollection, he used the words, "Oh yeah," and then there was a rape pile. I said, "What? What is that? What are you talking about?" And he goes, "Yeah, it was all the guys jump on each other and, And I said, "Do you understand what that means?" He said, "What do you mean? Not a big deal. All the kids say it." I said, "What?" And I stepped in and I said, No. We don't speak like that. This is what that means, son. And he had no idea. And then he's like, "Oh my goodness." And if there was somebody in her life when she was little to say, "Oh my goodness," that's not okay. That's not okay. It starts very young. Tony, I see your hand.
Yes. So for me, because I was not there, I come in as the child after, I guess, the aftermath of the rape, the aftermath of the sexual abuse and other things that went on in my mother's life. And I can refer people to page 44 in the book and just briefly read an excerpt at the top that reads, "My birthday gift was to bring Antoinette home, but I brought her back to a crazy house. The baby shifted the family dynamic tremendously. My mother, my brothers, they all got a second chance with my child. A baby was a blank slate, the girl my family could do better with, and I watched as the baby changed them into people I did not recognize." So for me, I was 30 years old before my mother shared the majority, or actually all of the trauma. I was 30 when I found out that I was the product of a rape, and other dynamics when my mother was going through the 12-step program. And so I began to break down the relationship between she and I, because it helped me to understand how I saw my mother as kind of standing outside, being very jealous of the relationship that I shared with my grandmother and my uncles, but I was the hands-off product. No one bothered me, no one molested me, no one so dares look at me the wrong way. And for all intents and purposes, my uncles weren't these big gangsters or thugs. They were just five guys from ages 10 to 18 when I was born. But there was a no hands policy when it came to me. So I reflect back to the conversations that I've had, because I was a curious person. I asked a lot of questions, and I still ask a lot of questions. And when my mother told me about the rape and what transpired thereafter, I went to my uncles to ask, why didn't anybody tell me? Because I'm the one that you can tell anything. I'm open. I don't care. And I was hounding one of them, and he said, you must realize that we were children too. And we did as we were told. It was hush hush and move along. But we were given direct orders that you were to be protected. And so I wonder if they then, as Keith was alluding to, learned that these things were not acceptable, and this time around or moving forward, this is how you behave. Because I was flabbergasted to find out a lot of the things that my mom told me, and my experience was so very different in that space, and it made me more emboldened, because I did have those protections. I did have friends who were molested by their uncles and would say to me, you have a house full of boys or house full of men, teenagers, that never happened to you. And I was like, yeah, no, that doesn't happen, but it does. And so I think for me, my family learned maybe from those experiences and some of the conversations that moving forward, this is what you do, this is how you behave. And so we moved forward with that piece in a positive way. And we did not, or today is not something that we struggle with that particular piece. There may have been, other things that happen with addiction and drugs and things of that nature, but there was never this particular piece that continued on down the generations.
That's amazing.
Such an honor to have you here.
Yes.
Insight and that additional context. And if anyone has not put it together, you are hearing the voice of Toni herself.
And if those of you who haven't read the book and you're just jumping on, you'll get to know what a treat it is to have her here with us today. Thank you for being here with us and sharing your story. Now, Emily, we'll take your last answer and we'll pass it over to Dr. Keisha to take the next question, if everyone's cool with that. All right.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly jump in and add on a word that kept popping up in my mind throughout these questions and throughout their responses, of survival, and just how right off the bat there was this need to survive, which, we know can significantly alter our perception of ourselves. What are we willing to do? What do we have to do to survive? How can we get something to survive out of all of our relationships? And there's so much to be said about, what might have prevented this type of experience, for, not only Susan, but everybody like her that has experienced this. I keep coming back to, I think, kind of what other people have touched on, is intention, and how do we prevent those who are also trying to survive from using others to get what they're looking to get, and kind of create that cycle. So yeah, survival is something that I keep coming back to, and just how she had to do what she had to do. Had to figure that out at such a young age, when there's no roadmap for that. There's no guidebook for that. Yeah.
Thank you, Emily. Yeah. Oh, we will pass the book club mic over to my co-moderator, Dr. Keisha, to take us to the next question. It's all yours.
Thank you. Question 2. What might have prevented the type of violence Susan experienced in her youth? How are larger forces in society connected to violence and trauma? And what role does community violence play? This is some of the things we're going to take this conversation further, because we've sort of warmed up in question 1. How do racism and gender come into play? The timing on this question is brilliant. And how do low wages or poverty, poor schools, and substandard housing threaten families? And I just want to remind everyone, if at any point, and particularly our YouTube audience, you are included in this, if at any point you feel tightness in your body, you feel overwhelmed, or this becomes triggering in any way, take the space you need. Take deep breaths. That could be as simple as breathing in deeply through the nose, exhaling through the mouth. Use the YouTube chat. You are in the community. Share your feelings. I encourage people who are watching to stand alongside and uplift anyone who's brave enough or courageous enough to step into this digital space. But I would be honored to hear from any of our panelists who might want to comment and contribute to this question. There's a lot here to digest, which makes me really happy, because it's an intimate group of us. So I'm really curious to hear your thoughts and anything you want to contribute to this. Keith, how can I not call on you with the shirt you're wearing? Whatever you want to say, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I guess what I wanted to say is, this question reminds me of the old African proverb that until lions become historians, their story will always be written by the hunters. Racism and sexism factor into the experience of Miss Burton as a child, because there's no more exploited body in America than that of a Black woman or a Black female child. I think we have to have a candid conversation about the fact that the system isn't really broken. The system's doing exactly what it's designed to do, because we educate kids on an agrarian model for industrial jobs that don't even exist anymore. And then we say, well, we don't know what's happening. We keep getting the same outcomes from the system for year after year, decade after decade, generation after generation. If you took the labels in this book of the crack epidemic off of it and just talked about it today, we're still dealing with substance abuse epidemics. We're still dealing with the absence of jobs. We're still dealing with educational systems that busing actually corrected nothing. It just gave the appearance of an intervention. So the bigger systems impacts on the experience of child's and the fact that we kind of ignore child abuse as the most prevalent health issue in America. There's a lot we could do, but we seem to be so invested in talking about it rather than actually letting that talk translate into programs, interventions, activities. And that's the thing I hope this book does, is that it motivates some folks to actually move from talking to actually doing some things differently to try and address these issues.
But I have to say it. And then Julie and David, I'm coming to you. I'm cheating, so it's happening. Life is lifing right now. I am jumping ahead to page 160. And this is a quote we talked about in our planning meeting, and it's relevant. I knew the phrase, the forest for the trees, but now I got it. Could it be that I'd been barking up a single tree when all around me a wildfire was raging? And this is one of the things I think makes Mrs. Burton's story so phenomenal, is that she understood that instead of looking at the isolated incident or the micro level or the community level, that the real advocacy was in the policy work and taking it to the systemic oppression level. And I think the way in which you bring that up, Keith, is absolutely honest and stark in the landscape we are in now, as we are watching a tale of two justice systems unfold right before our eyes. But I'm off of that soapbox because I want to hear from Julia, pardon me.
Oh, you're fine. And 100%, like we can tell so much that it's the systems that have to be looked at, like working with SA survivors all the time. Like, I know sexual harm is not isolated to certain groups. It impacts us across identities, right? Like age, size, color, gender, sexuality, race, but very, very much disproportionately impacts communities of color, women, and then trans and non-binary communities, like are hit the hardest when it comes to sexual harm. And looking at power differentials and the impacts of that, these differentials exist between people or systems, like really act as a multiplier for how traumas are impacting them. That difference in a child and adult, the citizen and the government, a patient and healthcare provider, like even between adults, like in a relationship where one has like a higher relative power, be it socially, politically, financially, all of these things fall into like the factor into that impact of harm, right? Like to the level that someone experiences, the person that's experiencing the violence, so many people have less tools at their disposal, like to protect themselves or to advocate themselves, like to speak to or even be aware of what resources could possibly be available to them. Like these systemic indifferences in power create most of the problem in people being able to feel like they have access to resource or support in these areas. And that is what stood out to me in all of these questions, is how much the systems come into play in making getting help so much more difficult depending on who you are and the community you're coming from.
There are some comments in the YouTube chat that I want to uplift to stand alongside your words. And thank you, YouTube community, for realizing that you are a part of this conversation. And so I'm going to take a second to read the comments that are here. Denise shared, I think, one of the most poignant moments when she realized her mother was complicit in the abuse. Leslie shared, the family betrayal was huge. All caps, 3 exclamation marks. Leslie, I hope I gave that the right energy you typed it in. Sarah shared, deep betrayal at an early age, separate the self from reality. or realities. And then Leslie, again, not being taught or trained on how to be open, vulnerable, express emotions, or speak up. Know what you know, etc. And I know that is speaking to the consistent theme within the story of being trained in silence, understanding that you don't talk back to adults. There's a really powerful line in the book where Mrs. Burton connects slavery and the way Blacks were taught not to speak back to master, and then they brought that home and how they raised their children. Denise shared, I identified with Susan's daughter that knew that she had to get away from the family to survive. Leslie shared, plus cultural narratives like, don't put our business in the streets. Tell the truth, Leslie. What happens in, I gotta say this right, because I'm not gonna lose my cultural credibility. Let me say it the way I know you meant it. Plus cultural narratives like, don't put our business in the streets. What happens in this house stays in this house. Plus pride, fear, shame, etc. fuel the dumpster fire. Very, very true. Christy asked a profound question that I don't know if we'll ever know the answer to, the full answer, because it's so layered. Why do people sexually abuse children? And then Leslie just wanted you to know, Tony, you're amazing. So YouTube community, we're reading your comments. This is a live recording in real time. So if you stand into the conversation, we will welcome you into this circle. David, I thank you for your patience. I would love to hear your contributions to this growing conversation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Keisha. First of all, I want to put a huge exclamation mark on Keith and Julia's comments, as well as our YouTube audience. I could not agree more. I'd like to state a couple of things. One is my tremendous concern for the worldwide energy we have of sexual exploitation of children and marginalized populations. Reading this book resurrects and brings up so much of the personal energy I have from my sexual abuse, and my heart goes out to the Burton family. I think the other thing that needs to be said is the rules and the dynamics that go with addiction and any kind of trauma are so excruciatingly isolating. It's almost like both of these dynamics and the disease of addiction has its own set of rules that further keep a victim from getting the help they need, because there is no worldwide communication, there is tremendous stigma, and there is, not to be Captain Obvious, but there is a dramatic gap in the resources for PTSD and addiction, especially in our marginalized cultures. Thank you very much.
Anytime, David. You will not be Captain Obvious in this space, because we are talking about issues that have been standing as long as this country was established. So all of this is in the category of Captain Obvious. So thank you. Tony, come through.
So I want to go back to the piece about Susan's mother, siblings, so on, and the complicity and how different our experiences were within the same family, different dynamics, different time periods. But for me, the whole the whole guise of the protection and nourishment that I received for me, because my mother did come to me to have those conversations. My grandmother was in such full-blown Alzheimer's that I could not have the conversations with her to discuss what happened. And so as I began to peel back some of the layers, I used the people that were still there to have those conversations. I am the person in the family that can say anything to anyone. And so as I began to have the discussions with my uncles and talk about these things, what resonated for me was the complicity was fear-based, and understanding the trauma within the family dynamic of the family being very afraid of my grandfather, afraid of his rage and his violence, and how he did business, I think played a part into some of the things that happened. It doesn't excuse the things that happened, but for me, what was so different, except for the date on the calendar, what was so different was my grandmother was now the head of that house, and she seemed determined to make sure that things ran differently. And again, I was not able to have a conversation, but I had to look at what was really different about that household. And the biggest difference about that household was not having my grandfather in that household. And don't get me wrong, I love my grandfather. He treated me great. I adored him. But if you talk to my daughter, she can't stand him. She was afraid of him. She didn't like his voice. She didn't like how he behaved sometimes, and didn't like his alcoholism. Whereas he moved different, he had different energy with me. But still, I began to see some of the differences in that process of how I was treated and how I got to my place. Was maybe they got to a point where enough was enough. And now that I have a voice. My grandmother comes from a family where her parents were not necessarily enslaved, but right on the heels. Her father was born in 1875. I just pulled it out of the census. Her mother right behind him. So right on the heels of slavery and on the heels of that don't tell and that type of atmosphere. For me, I think my grandmother maybe arrived at a place where I didn't do what I was supposed to do here. So moving forward, I'm going to do this, and everybody coming along with me is going to do the same, because my experiences were vastly different. And it was really a bone of contention, and created a lot of tension between me and my mother, because she was not there for great portions of the time. She did not know what happened, and didn't understand how much I advocated for my grandmother, for my uncles. I advocated for them because they were my true and tried protectors, and they taught me to be fearless and taught me to speak up. And she and I, having such different experiences, we just bumped and we clashed, and we bumped and we clashed. And it wasn't until we really had that conversation when I was 30 that I began to understand where she was coming from, because quite frankly, before that, I didn't know. No one shared it with me, including her.
Tony, you're bringing up so many powerful points, and you're actually adding depth to the questions we have here, because as I listen to you, we ask, how are the larger forces in society connected to violence and trauma? What role does community violence play? And we ask, how do low wages or poverty, poor schools, and substandard housing threaten families? But in your answer, I'm also hearing how families are forced to find ways to create new dynamics that normalize what safety has to look like. Mm-hmm. I heard that in your retelling of your grandfather, mm-hmm. how fear was such a massive thing. But then when your grandmother became the head of the household, she created, mm-hmm. and it highlights the invisible part, or the accompanying, it's more than duality. It's the silent avenue of, if we go back to the 1877, the Reconstruction. Mm-hmm. I think that's the language. Mm-hmm. It's highlighting the Reconstruction these families, these communities are forced to create as the result of having to live under such trauma, mm-hmm. as we saw in slavery, mm-hmm. how for that beautiful 10, 11-year period. Mm-hmm. But the perspective, the ability to see it, right, is so necessary depending on what you experience. Because as I listen to you, I realize we don't hear that in the book. We really don't hear the voices of the uncles who learned from what Susan went through and made a point that there's a hands-off policy, that Tony will be protected. We don't hear as strongly the voice of your grandmother saying, our house will not continue to live under this fear. Mm-hmm. And so I'd love to hear from other panelists and what anyone else thinks about that, but you're highlighting that invisible life, hidden aspect of this that we rarely see. And it's not that it's something to be celebrated, but it is the necessity of how we survive, because you can't live under this tension. You will be submerged. So I see, your hand being raised is just rude. I don't care for it.
Yeah, and just to expound on that, that when my mother began to get book offers, movie offers, and other things, there was a producer that I spoke with, and irritated me to my core, because she kept asking me, what did my uncles do to me? And I told her they didn't do anything to me. And, I finally ended with, she says, well, the only dynamic difference was you versus your mom. Your mom had her brothers, you had your uncles. And I had to stop and think about what she was saying. And that's when I realized my mom and my uncles had my grandfather. They had their father who was in the picture. And there was, he ruled with more than an iron fist. And for all intents and purposes, when you're writing a book, there's a character limitation, because there's a whole lot that's missing from the book. And there was an incident that occurred that just really hit me to my core, where my grandfather, who was abusive to my grandmother, came home and brought his girlfriend home. And my grandmother protested, and my grandfather beat her in front of the girlfriend and the children. And, and I was thinking, like, you got to be kidding me, because they'd have been picking him up in a body bag if that's me. But I can say that today, but we're talking about 1950, whatever. And things look so differently. And there had been that systemic abuse. There had been the abuse of my grandfather going to the war, coming home, not being able to find a job. Society's, what role does community violence play? The systemic racism that society perpetuated on my grandmother made him choose to carry it out on my grandmother, the family. And they then became these, they became so fearful, and they accepted so much. And again, having a conversation with this woman, I had to kind of finally just shut her down and explain to her, I don't know what conversation you had with my mother. I'm giving you this conversation with me. You will not find a story in that piece unless you're finding a story on how we got from that piece of violence, that piece of abuse, to moving forward in getting past that and finding a way to survive. And, that's kind of where I left it on the table, but it made me think. And that factor was not having my grandfather in that household.
Yeah. I was actually recalling the moment where you're in the book, I think it's on me, or May 21, 21, 22, where your mom's talking about the spoon being tossed to her and it burned her so bad. And the tone of how she says, they'd never dare pull this kind of prank if Daddy had been around. I mean, when you're telling us there's way more to that story, I can imagine what would have happened, right? And so that just really brings home, the family systems and how it altered and it changed. And she ends that paragraph saying, the scar would be with me for life. And then that makes me think of how that scar, I have curiosity around it being a reminder of her feeling unprotected, so unprotected that she kept from her own daughter until you were 30 years old about the truth of what happened to her. Thank you very much for sharing, because also one other thing that stood out to me was, though that was those horrible, tragic things happened right before this, she talks about there were glimpses of where she did feel family support, like the spelling bee.
Yeah.
She remembers. So it's not like, it's so easy for people to read into someone else's story and make judgments, right? But there are nuances to this. Mm-hmm. We're human beings. And she literally says, she says, she and my brothers put on nice clothes, and I looked out from the stage and I saw them. It's a pivotal memory. My family showing up for me, rooting for me. It's so nuanced. And it's so easy to just write things off, but there's so much more to your story, to her story, to your family story. And I honor you being here.
Thank you.
I'm going to just highlight a few comments from our YouTube community. Arthur, thank you. I almost said your name incorrectly, but people in the chat are looking out for me, and I appreciate you. Arthur shared, there's a book called The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk that actually talks about how child abuse and neglect are one of the biggest issues in America. I think we have heard of that little book. I think it is on a few of our shelves right now. And I thank you for highlighting that, because not only does it talk about that, but chapter 14 gives a lot of real practical tools on how you can start to address, move forward, and deal with the trauma you carry. And that was, I think, one of the biggest gifts of that book, is that it gave us tools on how to move forward. Sarah shared, risky behaviors are maladaptive survival mechanisms. Okay, you're sounding like one of my cohorts. Somebody in the mental health field is in the room. Happy to see you. Thank you for being here. Angelique made a comment that's directed to Christy that says, I'm curious about what that looks like for you. So let me read what Christy shared. I feel like there are a lot of resources for people who have been sexually abused, but I think we need to focus more on the abuser and preventing abuse and getting resources aimed at preventing abusers. And that's why I love a good discussion, because it leaves room for all of the various perspectives. And so I thank you, community, for contributing. I thought I saw some more hands. Did people put their hand down? We still have time. This ain't over. Where'd you go? Okay, there we go. And there was another one. Oh, see, we're going to be all right. Keith, I'm going to call on you. And then David, I'll call on you. And then we'll go to question 3. And just so you know, this is semi-structured. The conversation controls the dialogue, not the question. So we don't get to all the questions, but we have a rich dialogue. Then we did what we came to do. Keith would love to hear from you.
Understood. The thing that stood out to me when seeing that there was this effort to give Tony a more sheltered and protected existence, to see Susan immediately make the comment that almost like the price that she had to pay for that was that she fell into like this Cinderella role, where she said that the family didn't have a use for her beyond cooking, cleaning, doing things in service to them. And it almost made the experience of reading about Tony's more protected life a bittersweet read, because it inadvertently became yet another time where Susan suffered a consequence. A transaction occurred that, yes, she was pleased and she saw her family in a different light, but it was almost like I caught myself going, damn, here it is happening to her again. And it was at times it was almost hard to be as happy as I wanted to be about seeing Tony have that experience that I wish Susan had had. But there she was again, giving herself in service to a transaction to get an outcome that was better. And it was just like, there were parts in this book where in these first 9 chapters where it just felt like, damn, Susan can't catch a break. You know, every time you think it's finally going to turn the corner, there's still something. And you know, and then what Tony shared about not even knowing that some of this had occurred until she was 30 years old. It's like, ooh, this book, this story, and you know, I'm sure from the outside, if it was a lot to get through 9 chapters of this, I can only imagine what the experience of living through those 9 chapters was like. But it was just tough to see that even something as beautiful as the effort to protect Tony still had a consequence attached to it.
Keith, thank you so much for naming that, because as I listen to you, I think about the Mr. Burke. It's hard to put the Mr. in front of the name. It's hard to acknowledge that that is how this character is, you know, introduced. And it's equally difficult to understand the implicit agreement that seems to be hinted at, in the sense of not only was Susan groomed for 4 years of being a victim of a pedophile in the way in which she was, but the fact that her family started eating more. She said they started eating eggs and bread, and they had, you know, more access to food. And the whole part about first he, you know, lures her in with the cookies. And then when he makes up his mind that, you know, she's going to be, to use language from the book, Papa's pick, there's that conversation where he goes to the house. The fact that he was bold enough to go to the house, sit down, and have a conversation. And then we, again, because as Tony points out, there's so much we don't know. But the way in which that story was put together was so difficult, because in the next thing you hear a mother say, you know, you're going to go to Mr. Burke's house. And I can only imagine the ripple effect of knowing, as Susan mentioned, she knew her body could get her things. How much of that experience is tied to that statement? Because that went on for what I counted was 4 years. David, I know, what a segue to hand it off to you, but David.
Thank you very much. Now, I'd like to dovetail on Keith, Tony, and your comments. because the last part of question 2, where they ask about wage, poverty, poor schools, substandard housing, the other thing that occurs to me is that birth order, gender, and generational placement offers such a unique perspective to the dynamics that Susan experienced, and also reinforces the family rules of addiction, the no talk, the no trust, the no feeling, because those are all dynamics that have a lot of risk to them. It is nothing less than phenomenal that Toni has broken all those rules with her mother and her uncles. Mm-hmm. And, I commend you for that, because I think it really speaks to your spirit. And I think it speaks to the curiosity that you shared with us this afternoon. But all these add up to how individuals, how cultures are trapped in our society. And it is such a public health and policy issue, without a doubt. I mean, if I sit back and think about the number of generations that have talked about incarceration, low wages, substandard housing, inequity of our educational systems, I get nauseated about the fact that we have done very little to impact change on all of those, let alone the 2 public health problems of addiction and trauma. I mean, it's almost embarrassing at times to say I'm from the United States, because of the lack of progress that we experience in these areas.
I just wanted to echo that, and I want to not speak long because I want to give the floor to Toni, but I literally just left a district meeting where there are 5 board members, and I'm one of 5. And before us every month in the summer, I've been doing this 6 years now, there are suspensions that we have to review. And there's suspensions for jumping the fence, trying to get into the pool, or there's suspensions for just breaking rules because they're kids, right? My kid doesn't go and read the policy of the district and know what rules are which. And so he's going to go and do what he wants. Now, I'm not speaking about my kid, but I am speaking about some of his friends. And I was just in a meeting where I had to watch, and I used this book as an example at the meeting, and I was outvoted 4-1. Kids were playing. They were boxing. They had boxing gloves, and they were boxing on district property. And the other members of my board felt it was more important, and it was a risk for the district and other people that these kids were up playing. And the father, who's a police officer, other people had come up. The mother was there. The kid was there. They were saying that wasn't our intention. We didn't know. Could you lift the suspension, or could you consider this? And I said, I consider it 30 days. He had already been 2 weeks. They're like, we really are concerned about his mental health. He's crying. He's not able to come up and be with his friends. And I thought about Susan and that dress code violation that seems so pivotal to me. If we as a system, my board, I felt like a failure leaving that board, being outvoted. Because what they did was they decided the 30 days plus 3 more months, this kid can't come up and hang out with his friends. That's what they decided. And I said, you all care way more about policy than you care about the mental health of the youth that we're bringing up in this country. And I can't stand for it. I got to go. And they're like, well, we want to talk to the attorney. You want to talk? I said, you can go ahead and talk to anybody you want to talk to. But as far as I'm concerned, I'm the only one on this board that's about to join a live discussion on trauma and the effects of it on someone and how it affects our community. And all they wanted to hear was the legalese. That's all they wanted to hear. So I think about your mom and I think about that dress code violation and the effect and the snowball that had, because she got suspended and then it just carried on from there.
Right.
Miss Spelling Bee, Miss
Mm-hmm.
Good Student, all of those things, and how that one thing was a catalyst to a lot. The floor is yours.
Yeah, I agree with you 110%. And so when the book came out in 2016, as my mom was working on, I think it was Prop 47 and some other initiatives, I would go with her to book readings and book signings, and I just kept running over this information that began to just really bother me. At the time, 2016, California had approximately, in the state system, 130,000 inmates. They were housed in 33 prisons. And so I started pulling the information together. So since 1980, California has built one university, UC Merced, but 22 prisons. We have a total of 33 prisons. So that means since 1980, California has built 66% of its prisons. And we're housing those inmates, and this is only 2016 numbers. The cost was $75,560 per year for each inmate. And it was more than it cost to put a child through Harvard. The people that we're saying we're going to throw away, we're spending in upwards of now almost $90,000 a person, but we don't even pay our teachers. And so when you talk about low wages, poverty, poor schools, substandard housing, all of these things factor into, and I had a conversation, I a couple of years ago retired from AT&T, and I worked in human resources, and someone got a hold of my mom's book. And so I started having these conversations with my constituents, with upper leadership in AT&T. I feel so complicit in this process. You take my tax dollars and you lock away my family and friends and community. When 3 strikes came, you told me if I voted for it, it would make our community safer. Me and my mom got into the biggest argument about the 3 strikes law. And if it had not been for her making me understand with the direction that it was going and that it did go, I too would have voted for that law. But it's, when was that law passed? It's 2023, and my community is no safer. I just increased the wall in my backyard by 2 feet to make it 9 feet to be a little safer. And I'm still dishing and doling out tax after tax after tax. And if I don't speak up, if I don't say something, I am complicit in this conspiracy to literally lock away my entire community, including me, if they can catch me.
Mm-hmm.
And so, that was my biggest take on my contribution to trying to help, the working class people understand, just because you've never been convicted of a felony, just because you've never been to jail, you've never had an addiction problem, you're still responsible to do something about what's happening. It's just not good enough to stay away from that process. And I directed that to a lot of my friends, a lot of my colleagues, and to upper leadership and anyone that would listen. You say, we're going to pass this bill, and then they pass a bill. The bill is to fix our roads. And then Congress comes in and says, oh, no, we need, 200 million. We need 33 million to go over to this project. We need to emergency meeting to take this. We're not even apprised of what's going on. And the next thing you know, we have all of these prisons. I couldn't believe I was reading 66% of our prisons have been built since 1980. And California has the biggest prison budget in the entire world. So when you talk about, how these affect us, what is California telling us? What are we telling ourselves? We really care more about locking people up instead of investing in the education, the YMCA, the YWCA, the after school programs, and all of those things. And we have to play more active roles in making our constituents bring these programs back. We have all of this money to lock people up, but imagine if the average prisoner grossed $80,000 a year in whatever work they did, whatever career they had, how different things would look. No, it's not going to eradicate crime, but it definitely would put a dent into all the things that we're going, especially when I know there are teachers. I have friends who are teachers who are carrying, tens of thousands of dollars in debt and only making $50,000, $60,000 a year in 2023. The math ain't mathing.
I'm going to read some comments from our YouTube community, and then Achara, I'm going to hand it over to you. If I am mispronouncing your name, then forgive me. I wish you were on the panel. Hopefully you'll become a panelist. You can come on here and tell me how to pronounce it. Hortensia? In our community of Coachella Valley, the tallest and largest, most expensive building is the jail.
Wow.
Sarah shared, social determinants of health and health disparities, food deserts are all social justice issues. She also shared a ripple effect phenomenon, running on autopilot. Angelique shared, I can see these issues over generations almost culminating in the current public health crisis. The intersectionality and pervasiveness and domino effects and cycles all coming together. And then Jean shared, don't know if you mentioned The Deepest Well by Nadine Burke Harris, which is a phenomenal book that is right in line with everything we've been discussing. And Denise had a really strong comment that is really relevant to a lot of what we see now. It's interesting that women's bodies are often seen as financial transactions, such as in survival sex, or in some cases, the implication that you have an ATM between your legs. I'm going to take a breath because we've been having very powerful conversations. And so I'm going to lead by example, and I invite anybody who wants to join me, because breaths are free and you can take as many as you'd like. Join me in just taking a deep breath and exhaling through the mouth. Let's just breathe as a community, because we're speaking some profound intergenerational truths. And acknowledging that we have a system that's more comfortable building prisons than colleges. And this has been a theme since 1980 and before. But 1980 is when we've seen it skyrocket. Achara, the floor is yours. Please don't ever raise your hand when I'm speaking. You are my cohort, my colleague, and my friend. And I don't want you to be called on. You are my co-moderator. Please continue to co-moderate alongside me, as powerful as you are showing up. And thank you for sharing what happened at that board meeting. These things need to be known.
Yeah, and as someone who serves there, I would have to put them through 2 years of training on trauma. It felt like, for them to understand that what they were doing is going to cost us more money as a society in the long run.
Hard.
And when I say that they were not hearing me, I got passionate. I had to I was like, I had to calm myself down again. And it's just they don't get it. And these are the people that are making decisions. That is why I serve in my community in this capacity. But it's election, right? So that to me is like, get out and vote and pay attention to what's happening in your local districts, right? Because these decisions are being made and you don't even know how it's affecting your kids or affecting your community. And it was difficult. So I appreciate that. And I raised my hand for the tech thing so they know to pop me on if they need to. So by the way,
Thank you.
just to name it for you.
Thank you for that. I needed it to be named.
Okay. So I think we got a little bit more time. So we can move to question 3 and maybe try to wrap up to take some thoughts on that, if that feels right. Yeah. So let's do that. People who work in trauma services sometimes use the phrase hurt people hurt people. How can we adapt this language to avoid victim blaming? We'll go to you, Julia. I see your hand.
I feel like I could write an essay on how much I do not like the oversimplification of this such regularly used phrase. Namely, because every advocate I know is a person who has been harmed. And while this is true in some ways, there are so many people that have been harmed, Susan, first and foremost in this conversation, that have gone on to advocate and support and make huge changes for other people in the world that have gone through the same things they've suffered. And getting specific with the phrase, it's more like hurt people that receive no community support, like don't have any realistic option to make healthier choices, don't experience safety, don't have the opportunity to choose healing. They have a higher chance of perpetuating the pain and trauma cycle with those around them. But if we, like Tony was mentioning, if we showed compassion and support to the root cause of the pain, we could be breaking that cycle, right? But instead of investing in supporting people that have been harmed, we're investing in incarcerating them and perpetuating that crisis cycle. I love in chapter 1 how Susan just tells us, you think that someone in the system might have gotten the bright idea that I need drug treatment, that I need therapy, but I was never offered help. I didn't know to ask for it because I didn't know what to ask for. And that was just such a powerful thing, because we don't know what we need if we've never seen it modeled. And the people who are at the highest risk of being harmed, the populations I talked about earlier, communities of color, LGBTQ communities, disabled folks, like they are far more likely to experience that compounding trauma that ends up in complex PTSD as a result of this hurt. And they're the exact same people who have their needs dismissed and ignored wholesale, the way Susan mentioned in this chapter, like it's not even a thought. And that is my speech on how frustrating this sentence is to me.
I say, bring the essay, that's what I say. Bring the essay.
Got time today. Absolutely.
This is the space to do that. Bring that essay, in regards to what it is this month. Pride Month is this month. And I think about every person that I know that is celebrating Pride Month right now. And not one of those people have not had wounds happen or hurt happen in their life, which is why they are so passionate about what they're speaking up for, their right to exist as they are. What's wrong with that, right? So yeah, bring that essay. And don't ever stop. David, I see your hand.
Thank you, Atra. Yeah, to me, when I hear hurt people, I think this is one of the many societal processes where a normalization of hurt or trauma re-victimizes those who have been wounded. I mean, as a trauma professional, I know a lot of people who have complex PTSD or PTSD and victimize others through rage, physical violence, sexual violence, all in an attempt to normalize their own trauma. But that does not help those victims who end up having the message, well, how were you dressed? What did you do? How do you see yourself as responsible for this hurt? I mean, we live in a society of victimization, re-victimization, and stigmatization from my perspective. And none of those processes really work to shift responsibility to the perpetrator, or in some cases, the criminal act itself. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much. All right, we're going to do about just about a few more minutes. So I'll take Emily and then Keith, and then we'll wrap up. So we have some time to wrap up.
Yeah, really quick. I was just going to say that when I hear this statement, also as a trauma professional, I think it's very surface level. It is that oversimplification. If you want to take it one step further, something that I like to think about is we can look at the explanation for maybe why someone has done something that they've done. So we're explaining, but we're not excusing. And I think sometimes that language helps folks dissect, take apart the victim blaming. You know, that if we can come up with an explanation for why someone did something, it might make it okay. So if we can separate those two things, I think it allows those two truths to exist, that sometimes, or if not always, we can find a reason why someone who has hurt somebody else, who has victimized another person, why they did that or where it came from, but that it really has no bearing on the fact that, you know, you're also a victim, you're also a survivor of whatever it was that you went through. Yeah.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you so much. Keith.
You know, piggyback on what you just said, it's something I hear my oldest son say frequently. Two things can simultaneously be true. We can both be a victim and also still be a perpetrator of harm on others. And I think what I try to take into consideration when I hear this phrase come up is that there's an opportunity to try and create some understanding, because oftentimes we're so mired in our own experience of harm that we don't stop to consider the harm that ripples out or echoes out from us into those around us. So I tend to reframe it as trauma creates echoes that we can't control. And unless we have an intervention to silence the scream that's coming out of us, that we don't have the ability to even notice that we're screaming. It's so loud we can't hear ourselves think. So when I hear the expression, I do agree with what everyone else has said, that it is surface level and can lead to victim blaming. But there's also an opportunity to help people stop and consider that perhaps there is something that they need to consider beyond the harm they've experienced. And are they actually participating in a perpetuation? I find myself asking as I review what was read, how many of the folks who felt appropriate to ask Tony, well, you have a bunch of uncles, hasn't this happened to you? There's a generational aspect to that. How many of them did experience that? How many of them learned to silence or to tolerate those from one traumatized person re-traumatizing another? We got to stop the echoes.
You
Can't
know,
change the original scream, but we got to work on the echoes.
yeah, and I'm so happy. I'm so glad you mentioned that piece at the end, because what you're speaking to is exactly what Tony shared with us earlier that happened in her family. And that reminds me at the very start of our conversation, Julia talking about that seatbelt. Like, we can't move forward unless we're able to have open dialogue and discussion about this awareness of what's going on. And I'm hearing you reflect that as something that is foundational, right, for that pivot or that shift to occur. Yeah.
And if I could add to that, the conversation with this director wasn't the first time that I'd actually had that conversation. I was about 9 years old on the school playground having a conversation with a bunch of other girls, and one girl was confiding in the other girls about what had happened to her with her uncle, and they were all talking about who lives in the house. And when I got to my house and said, I have 5 uncles, they literally were astonished that I had not been molested. And I was astonished that this was even a thing. I didn't even know what it was. And I literally went home to ask the uncle that was at the house when I arrived home. And he was like, no, we don't do that. And again, we don't talk about that. We don't do that. It's not happening. That's a bad thing. But who did you have this conversation with? And why are you guys talking about that? And I said, well, I kind of joined the conversation. And he was like, we don't do that. But we don't talk about that anymore. And I never brought it up again because it was like a non-factor for me, but it was something that I kind of chucked into a back pocket that, oh my God, yes, this does happen. Even though it's not happening in my house, it does happen. But I never talked about it again for decades.
Yeah. Tony, I just so grateful for you being here with us to give us, as Dr. Keisha said, a peek or some vision of that invisible part of the story that we don't know and we couldn't see, and just to let us into that. So special for me as a moderator, and I'm sure for us as a panelists and our viewers to hear a bit more. It's like, they talk about it in film, whatever, the fourth wall. I feel like that's what you brought to us. We're part of this story with you now, and that hasn't happened before. And at least for me, I feel that way. I feel like I'm now part of the ongoing story of how this has impacted your life and your mom's life. And I look forward to hearing more as we talk more about the things that you guys are doing now with the new way of life and so forth. But I know we have to wrap up, so I'll hand it back over to Emma.
All right. So this brings us to a close to our absolutely phenomenal discussion today. Thank you to our panelists, new and returning. Thank you to our absolutely phenomenal moderators, just, oh my gosh, magnificent, Dr. Keisha Zerbois and Atra Tarfa. And thank you to the TRF team who are all making this book club happen behind the scenes. And to thank you, our virtual audience, for spending your time with us and participating in today's discussion. We look forward to seeing you at the same time next week for our second session of this 4-part series. Next week, we will be discussing mass incarceration. Everyone who has registered for book club will receive an email with next week's YouTube link before the next session. You can also find that information when you log into your TRF members account. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you again to our moderators. Very quickly, we have a special treat for you, 2 treats. So one, our moderators had the two brilliant ideas, actually. We have created a digital care package for you. And we have put together some resources with the help of our moderators and TRF free resources for you. Liz is going to drop that link into the chat for you to browse resources that may be of interest for you following this conversation. And I will give this over to Dr. Keisha to introduce the next treat for you. Take it away, Dr. Keisha.
Thank you. So there's a series called The Conversation After the Conversation, and YouTube community, you are invited to be a part of it. Any of our panelists that want to come on, this will be in 30 minutes, so 6 p.m. Eastern time. So you have time to take a break. But the whole point of this conversation, it's meta. It's the conversation after the conversation, because I can't experience this and not want to talk about it. And so it's another platform for us to connect further and also really explore some of the things that came up. Keith's statement about trauma creates echoes that we don't control. We hear the screams, but we have to address the echoes. We're going to start the conversation there. So join us with the conversation after the conversation. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you, Dr. Keisha. Thank you, Achara. Thank you to our incredible panelists for your insight, your wisdom, your contributions, and for bringing your full selves to today's incredibly important conversation. And we're looking forward to seeing everyone who is seeing us